Welcome to episode 24 of In the Abstract, the Lakeland Title podcast. And for this episode, I'm going to talk about the top 5 reasons people get evicted and how you can avoid those. I'm your host, Bryan Jeansonne, the founder and owner of Lakeland Title. So let's get into it. I practiced landlord-tenant law for about 10 years. And through that, I handled a lot of evictions, both for landlords and tenants. So, sometimes I was trying to evict someone for a client. Other times I was defending someone who was getting evicted. So I've seen a lot of evictions. I've been to a lot of eviction hearings. And so I was just going to go through the top 5 reasons most times those tenants got evicted and ways you could possibly avoid that. So the number 1 reason is not showing up for the eviction hearing. So a lot of people think just because they get an eviction notice that it's all over and there's nothing they can do, and they just figure, fine, I'll just leave and not even show up to the eviction hearing. If you don't show up to the eviction hearing, you're definitely going to lose because you won't be there to argue your side. So number 1 is show up to that eviction hearing and at least say your piece. You may not win the eviction hearing, but you could always ask the judge, look, I know I should be getting out. Can you just give me a week, or can you give me through the weekend? Because in places like Louisiana, once that eviction is granted, you have 24 hours to get out. And so that's, realistically not a lot of time for people to find a new place to live. But you can always go into that eviction hearing and ask the judge. And most times they will do it. They will say, landlord, are you okay with giving them a few days to get their stuff out? And it's usually fine. So go to it for that reason alone, but also just go to make your argument. Because, hey, you never know. I mean, you may win. Just because an eviction is filed does not mean that the eviction is legally valid. So that's number 1. Is go to that eviction hearing and make your argument. Number 2, most common reason that I would see for people getting evicted was not having proof that they paid their rent. Now, in some cases, they actually hadn't paid their rent, and then there's not really a big argument that you can make because you didn't pay your rent and you need to pay your rent. But sometimes people would pay their rent with cash, or they would pay with a money order, and the landlord would lose track of it or forget that they had paid it, or for whatever reason, the landlord thought they didn't pay their rent, but they actually had. They just didn't have any proof to show that. They didn't keep a copy of the money order. They didn't have a cash receipt showing that they'd handed over cash. So if you're paying your rent with the money order, keep a copy of that money order. And I would get the property manager or the landlord to sign a receipt every time you turn in that rent saying that they got your rent for that month, so that if you do get evicted, you can go to that eviction hearing and say, nope, here's the receipt that the landlord or the property manager signed saying that they got my rental payment, or here's the copy of my money order made out to the landlord for that month. So I did pay my rent, and then in that case, you won't be evicted. Same thing with cash. Just get that receipt, some sort of proof that you paid the rent. And that way they won't be able to evict you for a non-payment. But that used to happen. I would see that all the time, is they had paid their rent, but they just didn't have proof of it. And if you don't have proof of it, it's your word against the landlord's. And usually in eviction hearings, they're going to believe the landlord in those circumstances. The third top one is withholding rent because of repairs. So I would see this all the time, is a tenant would request repairs, the landlord wouldn't make the repairs, and so the tenant would then withhold the rent because the repairs weren't being made. Now, in a lot of places, and in Louisiana where I practice, under Louisiana law, that is not a reason you can withhold rent. So in Louisiana, if a landlord doesn't make repairs in a timely manner after you've requested them, you can make the repairs yourself and just deduct that from the rent. Now, again, you're going to want to keep proof of everything in that situation, get estimates and all that kind of stuff and proof of what you paid, but that's the legal remedy. So withholding rent is not a legal remedy. So I would see that all the time, is they'd withhold rent because the landlord wasn't making a repair that they had requested, and then they ended up getting evicted because that's not the legal remedy. And so if your state is like that, just remember that you'll get evicted for that, but it's easy to avoid just by following the legal guidelines in your state for what to do if a landlord doesn't make a repair when you request one. The fourth would be various clauses in the lease that are not really that important. They're in the lease, so they technically are important and you should do them, but they're what's called a non-material breach. And that's the phrase you would use when you would go to an eviction hearing in this situation. So a non-material breach would be something like a lot of leases require you to get renter's insurance. And so if your landlord was evicting you because you didn't have the renter's insurance, or they would have a list of rules and things like that for the place that you're living and you weren't following them. And so they would try to evict you for that. Or, just various little things in the lease that are important, but not really that important. And so you would go to the eviction hearing and you would tell the judge, this is a non-material breach. I'm paying my rent. The place is in good condition. I pay my rent on time. What is the problem here? I'm generally abiding by the lease. This is not really anything that warrants you kicking me out of the house that I'm living in or the apartment that I'm living in. And a lot of times that works, because it is true. I mean, a lot of times these judges will look at these landlords and just say, they're paying the rent. What's the problem here? And so that's a big one, non-material breaches. So that's another one. And the last one is late payments. So a lot of times tenants would be paying the rent. They would just be consistently paying the rent late. And eventually a landlord would get tired of that, and they would tell them, I just want you out. I want somebody new who's going to pay the rent on time. I'm tired of, accepting rent on the 15th when it's due on the 1st. And so just, I want you out. And so they would try to evict somebody for that. But if you show up to that eviction hearing, you can make the argument that, look, he's been accepting the rent late for months. And if you can show proof of that he's been accepting the rent late for months and it's never been a problem, why is it all of a sudden a problem now? And you can make that argument. And a lot of times it works. The landlord established a custom of accepting the rent late. And so he can't just all of a sudden decide, I don't want to accept rent late anymore. And so that works a lot of times too. Of course, like I said, with number one, you got to show up to an eviction hearing to make that argument. So those are the top 5. Some bonus things about evictions, automatic renewal clauses. You're going to want to pay attention to those in your lease, because I would see this happen a lot where, it would be a year lease or a 2-year lease. There would be an automatic renewal clause saying that if nobody says anything and you stay there and keep paying rent, the lease is going to renew, but it's going to be on a month-to-month basis. So instead of having a year lease, because that's expired now, you've been there a year, but it just renews and you're still there, but you're just on a month-to-month basis, so that the landlord could decide they want to terminate the lease and they want you out, within the next month. And I would see that happen a lot, where people are just kind of surprised that, that they could be basically kicked out or not have their lease renewed that quickly, with that short of notice. But it is what happens. You're on a month-to-month. So if, if they decide they don't want you there that next month, they can do that. So you'll just want to be mindful of that and, talk to your landlord before the lease is expiring, so that you can sign a new lease with a new longer term. You can do that as an amendment to the lease. You don't have to sign a full new lease if your landlord doesn't want to go through that trouble. So you can tell them that, like, let's just do a 1-page amendment to the lease and do it that way for, giving me another year or 2 years or whatever you want. That way you won't be, stuck on that short notice of 1 month the landlord decides they don't want you to live there the next month. And so a final one is the legal delays. So in Louisiana and in many other states, the eviction laws are very technical. And so there are certain legal delays that are within those eviction laws that must be abided by. So, the eviction hearing can only happen within a certain amount of time of you getting notice of it. There are certain notices that the landlord has to give you, and the landlord has to abide by those, or the eviction has to be thrown out. So you're going to want to check on those laws in your state and make sure that the landlord has abided by those. If you're legitimately being evicted, you legitimately didn't pay rent or something like that, it's not going to stop the eviction from eventually happening, but it could stop that eviction hearing from happening and at least give you some time to find a new place to live, instead of that kind of quick schedule that evictions usually go on. So I hope y'all found that helpful. Again, a lot of this was based on Louisiana law, so check your state's laws. But those were the top things that I saw when I was doing eviction work, for those 10 years. So if you have any suggestions for future episodes, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can comment with that down below. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform, you can email us at podcast@brclosing.com. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please also subscribe, give us a good rating, and we will see y'all next time.